The forest was a symphony of stillness and hushed movements, the silence punctuated by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant cry of an owl. Deep within the heart of the wilderness, where the trees grew close together and the canopy above nearly swallowed the sky, the scent of earth and pine hung thick in the air. It was the time of year when the first frost clung to every surface, where every breath of air was visible, and the sun barely pierced the thick layers of mist and branches. This was the time when the forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the inevitable arrival of winter. In the heart of this remote, isolated sanctuary lived a solitary black bear named Koda. His thick, dark fur had grown heavy, a natural response to the freezing temperatures that were slowly inching closer with each passing day. He had spent his life in this vast stretch of wilderness, roaming freely beneath the towering trees and beside the ever-flowing streams. But as the winter months crept forward, his instincts began to stir. It was the time to prepare for the long sleep, the hibernation that would stretch for months. But first, he needed to ensure he had everything necessary to survive the harsh, unforgiving months ahead. Koda's den was deep within a rocky hollow beneath the roots of an ancient oak, its entrance hidden beneath a blanket of leaves and snow. He had spent days gathering the last of his food-fallen berries, the remains of small mammals, and the scraps left behind by the forest's other creatures. But despite his efforts, something gnawed at him. There was an odd quiet to the woods, a silence that made the hairs along his back stand on end. The usual sounds of squirrels scurrying through the underbrush, the calls of birds migrating south, had all but disappeared. The wind itself seemed muffled, as though the world was closing in, holding something back. As he retreated into the den one chilly evening, the shadows in the forest grew long, and the moonlight filtered through the trees, casting an eerie glow across the landscape. Koda felt an unease in his chest, a tightening, a foreboding sensation that made his heart beat just a little quicker. His instincts, honed over years of surviving in this vast wilderness, were on edge. The days turned into weeks, and with each passing night the cold grew deeper. The wind howled through the trees, sending branches creaking and groaning under the pressure. Koda settled deeper into his den, his body growing sluggish from the long winter slumber that awaited him. But despite his drowsiness, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. On one particularly frigid evening, the sounds of the forest shifted. A faint rustling reached Koda's ears, a movement that was not the wind, not the snow falling from branches, but something far more deliberate. He perked up, his instincts fully awake. There, just beyond the entrance of his den, a shadow moved. Koda's muscles tensed, the hair on his neck bristling as his eyes darted to the source of the disturbance. For a moment, nothing stirred. The shadow disappeared, swallowed by the darkness of the forest. But Koda didn't relax. Something was out there, something that didn't belong. The night passed slowly, with Koda lying wide-eyed, alert to every shift in the wind, every crack of a branch. The rustling came again, this time closer, unmistakable, and unyielding. It wasn't the usual nocturnal visitors, a raccoon or a deer skirting by. This was something bigger. The ground trembled slightly under its weight. Then, just before dawn, it appeared. A silhouette stepped into the soft moonlight, moving silently as though it had been born from the shadows themselves. It was another bear, larger than Koda, with fur matted from the elements and eyes that glinted with a predatory hunger. Koda's body froze. This was not a bear he recognized. It was not one of the many solitary figures that roamed the wilderness. This one seemed different. For a long moment, the two bears stared at each other, separated only by a few yards of thick brush and fallen leaves. Koda could feel the weight of the intruder's gaze, a challenge that sent a surge of adrenaline through his veins. But the black bear stood still, seemingly content to wait, as if testing the air for some invisible sign. Suddenly, the silence was shattered. A low growl vibrated through the air, a sound so deep and resonant that it rattled Koda's bones. The intruder stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, its eyes fixed on Koda with unnerving intensity. Koda's pulse quickened, but he did not retreat. He was the guardian of this land, the ruler of this den. No one, not even another bear, could take that from him. But as the intruder advanced, Koda's mind raced. The winter was coming, the earth was growing colder by the day, and yet this bear seemed unfazed, too aggressive for the season. Koda's survival instincts began to tell him something else. This bear was not just a rival for space. It was a threat, and it had been following him for days. A sudden shift in the intruder's stance made Koda's muscles twitch, but before he could react, the air seemed to grow even colder, and then nothing. The figure vanished into the trees without a sound, leaving Koda in the stillness, his senses overloaded with the rush of adrenaline. Koda waited for what felt like an eternity before slowly stepping out of his den to find nothing but the silence of the forest. The intruder was gone, but something else had changed. Koda could feel it in the air. There was no longer a simple calm, no longer the quiet hum of winter settling into the earth. Instead, there was a weight, an ominous pressure that pressed down on him from all sides. Days passed, and the unease did not lift. Koda returned to his den, his steps slow and measured, but each crack of the snow beneath his paws was met with an unspoken tension. The mysterious bear had not returned, but the cold had grown sharper, harsher. The world around Koda had shifted in ways he couldn't understand. Then the storm came. It was sudden and violent, the wind howling through the forest with a fury Koda had never experienced. The sky turned a deep gray, and the snow fell in thick, suffocating sheets. Inside his den, Koda tried to settle back into the safety of hibernation, but the storm raged on outside, the trees groaning under the pressure. As the storm reached its peak, Koda's heart skipped a beat. Through the driving snow and the screeching wind, he heard a sound, a familiar one, the low growl. This time it wasn't an intruder, it wasn't a rival. It was the sound of something far more terrifying, a herd of wolves, drawn to the scent of weakness in the storm. Koda knew that the only way to survive now was to fight, to push back against the cold, the wolves, the snow. But as he stood, bracing for what was coming, the ground beneath his feet cracked open with a deafening roar. The ice had broken. Koda, in a single motion, lunged toward the entrance of his den, just as the walls of ice and snow collapsed in on themselves. He had misjudged it. He had waited too long, but now there was no turning back. As Koda scrambled to flee the rising tide of water and ice, he realized the truth that had been hidden from him. The storm, the shadow, the pressure had all been warnings. The world was changing, faster than he could ever prepare for. The forest had come alive with a new, terrifying force, a force far greater than any single creature could contend with. And just as the ice and water claimed the land, Koda, the black bear, vanished into the storm. His winter, not just the season of hibernation, but the beginning of something else entirely. The story of Koda would become legend, not in the memories of the forest creatures, but in the winds and the ever-shifting tides. The land was changing, and with it, the very nature of survival. As the storm raged on, the once familiar landscape of Koda's home transformed before his eyes. The forest that had stood for centuries was being reshaped by the ferocity of nature itself. The trees swayed violently, their roots barely clinging to the earth as the ice continued to spread across the ground. The snow no longer fell in gentle, soft flakes. It was now sharp and biting, each gust of wind cutting through the landscape like a blade. Koda fought against the bitter cold and rising waters, his paws sinking deeper into the snow and slush as he moved toward higher ground. His thick fur, once a source of warmth and strength, felt like a burden in the face of this merciless storm. The snow was falling so heavily that the world around him blurred into a constant swirl of white and gray. The low growl of wolves echoed in the distance, adding to the chaotic symphony of nature. They were coming closer now, drawn to the scent of vulnerability, to the confusion of the forest as it twisted and churned under the weight of the storm. Koda's heart raced as his muscles strained against the force of the elements. The wolves were not his immediate concern. The storm, the shifting ice, the treacherous landscape. It was all happening so quickly, so unpredictably. But even as the world seemed to collapse around him, Koda knew one thing with certainty. Survival, at least in the way he had known it, was no longer a matter of simple instinct. It was something far more complex. The ground began to shake again. It wasn't the usual tremor of an earthquake or the rumble of distant thunder. It was a deeper, more primal shaking, as though the very earth itself was recoiling from the changes. Koda stopped, his sharp senses alert. In the distance he saw a flash, a flicker of something that didn't belong. It was a soft, unnatural glow amidst the storm. With his breath coming in labored gasps, Koda crept forward, his every step slow and deliberate, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The glow grew brighter, and as Koda moved closer, the unmistakable shape of something large and black emerged from the snow. It wasn't another bear. It was larger, more menacing. The shape seemed to pulse with an eerie energy, radiating an unnatural warmth amidst the freezing cold. And then, as though it had been waiting for Koda, the figure turned. Its eyes are not those of a bear or any other creature Koda had ever encountered. They were deep, hollow voids. Eyes that seemed to draw in all the light around them, a darkness that Koda could not comprehend. Koda froze. The hairs on his neck stood tall, a deep sense of dread washing over him. His instincts screamed at him to flee, but the storm, the creatures of the night, the ice, the ground was shifting under his feet. He had nowhere to run. The glow of the figure intensified, growing brighter until the snow around Koda began to melt, turning into steam and mist. The air, once biting cold, became warm, thick with an unnatural humidity. The figure loomed larger, its form no longer a shadow but a solid presence, towering over Koda with a strange, almost hypnotic pull. It was then that Koda understood. This was not a creature born of the forest, not a survivor of the wilderness like him. No. This was something far older, far more powerful, something that had slumbered for generations beneath the earth, and now, with the storm's fury, it had awakened. The ground shook again, this time more violently, as the figure's presence began to merge with the storm itself. The trees swayed and cracked, the ice beneath Koda's paws groaned in protest, and the wolves howled, now closer than ever. It was as if the very fabric of the world had torn open, and the laws of nature no longer applied. Koda could feel the weight of the forest shifting, could sense that everything he had known, the rhythms of the seasons, the quiet majesty of the trees, the dominance of his role in the wilderness, was being rewritten in real time. The storm was not just a storm, it was a herald, a signal of something far more ancient, something that could not be understood, only felt. The ground beneath Koda's paws began to crack open, a vast chasm splitting the earth. The water and ice poured into the fissure, creating a river of chaos that surged forward, threatening to swallow everything in its path. The once safe den, the protective shadows of the trees, the familiar paths through the forest, all of it was being consumed by the unstoppable force of this new reality. With a final surge of energy, Koda leapt forward, his powerful limbs carrying him across the ice, his body desperate for escape. The wolves were closing in now, their glowing eyes reflecting the storm's strange light, but Koda no longer cared. He had to survive, to adapt, or else he too would become lost to this new world. As Koda sprinted through the shifting landscape, the twisted figure that had emerged from the storm seemed to follow him, a dark looming presence just beyond his vision. And though he ran as fast as his muscles would carry him, Koda couldn't shake the feeling that he was no longer in control of his own fate. The forest had been a place of strength, of survival, but now it was something else. A place of mystery, of danger, of forces beyond comprehension. The storm raged on, its fury unyielding, and as Koda pressed on through the swirling snow, he knew that nothing in the forest would ever be the same again. The winter was no longer just a time of cold and hibernation. It had become something far more terrifying. And whatever had emerged from the depths of the earth was only the beginning of a long, dark winter that would reshape the wilderness forever. Koda's last vision, just before the storm consumed him completely, was of the figure, its hollow eyes locked onto his, pulling him towards something far more ancient and unknowable. And then, the world went black. Koda's senses faded as the snowstorm enveloped him. The last thing he felt was a sudden shift in the air, a subtle tremor beneath the snow-covered earth. For a long moment there was nothing, no sound, no movement, just the hollow quiet of the storm. Then, slowly, like an awakening, Koda regained consciousness. He didn't know how much time had passed, but his body felt heavier, the ground beneath him softer than it had been before. He lifted his head, blinking against the snow, now gentle compared to the violent gusts that had carried him earlier. The air around him was different, almost alive with a strange warmth that seeped into his bones. As he staggered to his feet, his sharp eyes scanned his surroundings. The forest was no longer the dense wilderness he had once known. Instead, it was an expanse of frozen trees whose bark was cracked and twisted like old gnarled hands reaching out from the earth itself. The snow beneath him seemed to glow faintly, casting an eerie light onto the scene. It was as if the storm had lifted, yet its influence remained. The trees swayed gently despite the lack of wind, their branches creaking like whispers from a distant time. Koda's instincts urged him to move, to leave this strange place, but something about the air held him there. There was a sense of calm now, a quiet that felt almost too perfect. His fur prickled with unease, his mind raced. Had he truly escaped? Had he outrun whatever that dark figure had been? Or was it waiting for him now, disguised within the shifting forest? The ground trembled again, but this time the tremor was far subtler, as if the earth itself were breathing. He felt it beneath his paws, a low hum that traveled through the soil and into his muscles. It wasn't painful, but it was undeniable. The earth was alive, and it was watching him. A sound pierced the silence. A low, haunting howl. The wolves had returned. Their calls echoed through the mist, but they were no longer the familiar predators he had known. These howls were deeper, more resonant, vibrating with something ancient. The ground shook once more, this time violently, as if responding to the wolves' call. Koda froze, every hair on his body standing tall, his eyes darting around in search of movement. And then, he saw them. At first they were just shadows moving in the distance, but as they drew closer, he saw their glowing eyes. The wolves were unlike any Koda had ever seen. Their fur was matted with the same strange glow that illuminated the snow. Their movements were unnatural, their bodies larger and more imposing than any wolf he had encountered before. They seemed to shimmer, as though they existed partly in one world and partly in another. The pack moved toward him slowly, deliberately, as though they had no fear of him, no urgency in their movements. They circled him, their eyes locked on his, their gaze unblinking, as though they were waiting for something. Waiting for him to make a move, or for something else to happen. Koda stood still, breathing heavily, his chest tight with fear and confusion. He had never been one to fear wolves. They were creatures of the forest, just like him. But these weren't wolves. They were something far more powerful, something otherworldly. Suddenly, the earth beneath his paws began to rumble again, more intense this time. A deep, guttural sound echoed from the heart of the forest, an unmistakable roar that shook the ground. The wolves stopped, their heads turning toward the sound. Koda, too, turned. There, emerging from the thick mist, was the figure, its shape no longer distorted by the storm, no longer just a shadow in the distance. It was a massive, black form, towering over the trees, its eyes glowing with the same hollow light that had haunted Koda's every step. The figure moved with an eerie grace, despite its immense size, its every movement rippling with unnatural power. It was not a creature of the forest. It was something else entirely. The wolves began to retreat, their glowing eyes wide with something like fear, their howl now a whimper. Koda's heart pounded as the figure approached him, its presence overwhelming, consuming the space around him. He wanted to flee, to run as far as his legs would carry him, but his body refused to move. It was as though the figure held him in place, its presence sinking into his very bones, paralyzing him with an ancient, primal fear. The figure stopped just before Koda, its eyes locked onto his. And for the first time, Koda felt something stir within him. A pull, an overwhelming sense of connection to the thing before him. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was something deeper, something primal. It was as though the forest itself was reaching out to him, speaking to him through the figure, through the earth beneath his paws. The figure's eyes flickered with a strange intensity. It was as though it was reading him, studying him, searching through his very soul. And then the rumbling sound came again, louder this time, a deep growl that seemed to vibrate the air itself. The figure leaned closer, its breath warm against Koda's fur. In that moment, Koda understood. The storm, the wolves, the twisting forest, it was all part of this. This force, this ancient being, was not an enemy. It was the forest's guardian, the spirit of the land itself, awakened after centuries of slumber. Koda's legs shook, but a strange calm began to settle over him. He wasn't meant to flee. He was meant to be here at this moment, when the forest had called upon him. The forest had chosen him.